So what I'm going to do in this lecture, and I must apologise for some of the bait and switch moves that have been going on, because when I submitted the original titles, frankly, I had no idea what I was going to be saying when I turned up. So what I am going to be talking about now is religious belief and the myth of scientific naturalism, apparently. And that is, in fact, the topic. But I'm going to start with a short history of conceptions of nature and the natural. So in his rather charming book, Studies in Words, C.S. Lewis doesn't shy away from the big challenges, one of which is the word nature. And in his discussion of this complicated and multivalent term, C.S. Lewis offers a very helpful suggestion for illuminating the many meanings of nature and its equivalents, going back to the Latin and the Greek. Quote, "The best clue is to ask oneself in each instance, what is the implied opposite to nature?" So, as I say, I'm going to begin this lecture with a short, quick and dirty history of nature, understood in terms of its opposites. And what I hope to show in this context is that the history of our commonplace natural-supernatural distinction, our understanding of it is relatively idiosyncratic and problematic. And it places constraints on how we conceptualise and experience the world, and it also limits our capacity to understand the experiences of our predecessors. Now let me jump ahead. Now, to do this, I'm not going to give you the full version. I'm just going to give you a few sample points from Western history, and I think you'll get the general point. So we're going to start, as has been customary in these lectures, with Aristotle, whose natural philosophy or science enjoyed a tenure that was longer than arguably any single thinker, arguably over 1,000 years. For Aristotle, as is well known, and again, don't worry about the details here, I'll cut to the chase in a minute. As well known, Aristotle says that a complete explanation of the world requires recourse to 4 causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. Now, we don't need to go too far into the details of this schema beyond knowing that the ultimate final cause for Aristotle is the key one, and that for him the motions of the heavenly bodies move in accordance with this final cause. They move for the sake of something that is divine and unmoved. The unmoved mover, or perhaps more strictly, the unmoved movers, plural. Now, if we inquire at this point about whether Aristotle's celestial physics is naturalistic or supernaturalistic, the obvious response is that the question is misconceived, because Aristotle is not working with any sense of naturalistic explanations that compete with supernaturalistic ones, and this is because he's not operating with a sense of nature that opposes it to the supernatural. In fact, he has a number of different kinds of opposites. So the chief one is nature versus chance in terms of explanation for Aristotle, given that his understanding of nature is... Sorry, I've lost myself here. This is not because he's... Okay. Given his understanding that the study of nature requires us to look at, quote, what happens always or for the most part, this is why we have the relevant contrast case. So for Aristotle, chance and accidental things are not natural and they're not part of a scientific study. And it's the chance and the accidental that threaten the regularity of nature's operations and represent a challenge to the possibility of scientific explanation. If anything, and in what will become a fairly consistent pattern for the history of Western science, divine beings or principles, or a single divine being, look more like a source of the regularity and hence intelligibility of nature's operations than an unhelpfully disruptive influence that will make scientific explanation impossible. Now, it's worth mentioning very briefly 2 other oppositions that are important for Aristotle: natural versus violent, and natural versus artificial. And these are kind of gratuitous references because they're not relevant to my story, but they are really interesting in the history of science. These distinctions also turn out to be important to the history of science, since on Aristotle's version of events, any human interference in natural processes renders them unnatural, or, as he would say, violent. So if I were to throw this up in the air, that would be a violent motion because I was involved, and its natural path is to fall downwards. This accounts for the resistance of early modern 17th century early 17th century Aristotelian natural philosophers to the new idea that experiments could tell us anything about nature. Because by definition it was thought that interference with nature by experiment would change the object of investigation, so it wasn't dealing with nature. Okay? Similarly, the natural-artificial distinction would seem to rule out the possibility of mechanics serving as a model for natural processes, since mechanics involves artificial human creations. And all of this is consistent with the fact that Aristotle's God is not a creative agent. Now again, this conception of natural that opposes it to artificial was challenged by Jewish and Christian thinkers for whom the world was created by God and hence was in a sense an artefact. Indeed, natural for these thinkers and directly contrary to Aristotle's understanding meant created by God. Arguably, the idea that the world was the product of a divine creative act assisted early modern thinkers make the case that mechanics could be combined with a genuinely realist account of natural motions. In other words, the scientific revolution is partly premised on the introduction of mechanics to describe the celestial motions. It would have been impossible under Aristotle's view, precisely because he makes these oppositions between natural and artificial. Right. Now, our second historical counterexample to a simple opposition involves a fairly simple point. I'll give you this one for free. I won't talk about that, but this is also relevant to conceptions of laws of nature because it opposes nature to law. Well, I've got convention there, but this is physis nomos distinction. But I won't talk about that. Jumping to late antiquity, the Christian philosopher John Philoponus, 6th century, argued against a number of prevailing scientific doctrines, rejecting Aristotelian dynamics and proposing in its place a theory of impetus that resembles our modern theory of inertia. Philoponus contended that because the world had been created by a single deity, the Christian God, stellar bodies, the stars, were not divine, and further, that the heavens and the earth must have similar properties and principles of motion. Aristotle had distinguished between celestial and terrestrial motions, completely different physics in each case. So, combined with the theory of impetus, the first contention thus represents a theological yet naturalistic account of the motions of the stars. The stars are not divine because there is only one God, therefore we must have naturalistic explanations for how they operate. The second, his unified theory of dynamics, celestial and terrestrial physics are the same, was similarly informed by his assumption of a supernatural creation of the heavens and the earth as a single act. I use supernatural in inverted commas there. These ideas played a role in later Renaissance rejection of Aristotelian ideas of motion and offer some vindication of historian Pierre Duhem's claim that Philoponus should be regarded as, quote, one of the main precursors of modern science. In sum, the monotheistic commitments of Philoponus led him to offer both a naturalistic account of heavenly motions, the stars are not self-moving celestial intelligences, and a unified dynamics, the same principles of motion operate in the heavens and the earth. Again, in this instance, it makes no sense at all to speak of a competition between naturalistic and supernaturalistic explanations, with the naturalistic explanations being successful. To a degree, what's going on here are competing theological conceptions, and the idea of a single creative deity provides the foundation for a more naturalistic explanation of celestial mechanics. Our third example involves the emergence for the first time of a formal terminological distinction between the natural and the supernatural. And I see Graham Ward up the back, who has written a fantastic little piece on this emergence of the natural and the supernatural. And I wish I'd found it before I did all the legwork, but I'm going to give you, again, a quick and dirty version of this distinction between natural and supernatural. As we've seen, Aristotle had contrasted the natural with the accidental, the artificial, the violent and the conventional. Early Christian writers had understood an alternative distinction between created, which is natural, and uncreated, although this was further complicated by the idea of a fall. And so the question was, which is the natural condition, the fallen condition or the pre-fallen condition? At any rate, a specific terminology of the natural-supernatural distinction does not become common until the late Middle Ages, and Peter Lombard is the guy who I think, starts to introduce it, although he doesn't have the exact terminology. So you can see his dates there. Lombard explains that some events in the world come about through the joint operation of divine causes and the causes inherent in things. These things are said to happen naturally. So here he is commenting on the creation and wondering what work God does directly and what happens naturally. So don't worry about the seminal cause stuff. The key thing here is that some things happen naturally and some things happen besides nature. And the things that happen preternaturally, and this will later become supernaturally, the causes for these things are in God alone. But the causes of natural things are in God and the creatures. So to speak of the operations of nature is still to speak of the operations of God. That's the point. It doesn't exclude divine activity. On this view, then, God's ongoing creative agency was always operative in natural events. The distinction between natural and supernatural, however, becomes widespread from the 13th century and increasingly then into the early modern period. But the key thing here is that this is not an exclusive disjunction between things where God is at work and where he is not. He is at work in both, but in different modes. So it's worth summing this up. The 13th century sees the first use of the Latin supernaturalis in any significant frequency. The natural-supernatural contrast distinguishes between two kinds of divine activity. Interestingly, and I haven't mentioned this, some theologians would actually adopt what we call methodological naturalism, and there's the Latin phrase, when discussing the operations of nature. And then finally, no one talked about supernaturalism in relation to explanations of natural phenomena. Now, there's a fourth aspect to ideas of nature that follows on from this, and I discussed this briefly in the session last week, or in the afternoon, and that's that we know from this view that God implants things in nature. God implants causes in nature. And God implants things in human nature, notably reason. Reason is thus typically referred to as the light of nature or the natural light. But remember, natural in this sense is the thing that gives us our nature because it is of divine origin. And this is clearly the use that we find in the early modern thinkers from Descartes, who consistently refers to the light of nature throughout the Meditations, by which he means a divine spark within us. The so-called Cambridge Platonists, who famously talk about reason as the candle of the Lord. Even the English philosopher John Locke, who uses the same expression and refers to reason as a gift from God. So the association of reason and nature and naturalism over supernaturalism is again complicated by our understanding of this notion of where our natural reason comes from. Crucially, for early modern thinkers, reason was only reliable because it was regarded as a divine gift. The justification for doing things with reason was its divine origin. Again, we get a very different story from Enlightenment conceptions of instrumental reason that just assert that reason is the way to go. Fifth and final example of why a natural-supernatural distinction does not map well onto the past concerns the modern development of laws of nature, and I'll talk about this more in the next lecture, but very briefly, the idea that nature is governed by universal mathematical laws appears for the first time in the 17th century, and it replaces the older idea from Aristotle that we've seen that nature operates according to causes implanted in things, right? The conception of laws of nature is that there are no causes implanted in things and that God imposes causal power by doing his thing. Descartes made the key move, insisting that natural philosophy dispense with the Aristotelian final causes and focus instead on efficient causes. If for Aristotle God had been the cause of all the cosmic motions as the final cause, for Descartes God is the efficient cause, the cause that does all the pushing rather than the final cause that does all the pulling. This did not result in a chaotically unpredictable world since... Just wait for our ambulance to go past here. This did not result in a chaotically unpredictable world, since divine immutability guaranteed both the immutability of the laws and the reliability of inductions based upon them. Indeed, if anything, the world becomes more predictable with this conception of laws of nature because it rules out the Aristotelian view of nature, which talked about things for the most part. Aristotle had always allowed for the accidental that weren't part of science. The laws of motion, says Descartes, quote, follow manifestly from the mere fact that God is immutable and acting always and in the same way, he always produces the same effect. English natural philosophers, or scientists as we would now call them, adopted the idea that the regularities of nature were divine decrees, although they differed from Descartes on the issue of how the laws were to be derived. Let me just catch up with the slides here. So here's Descartes, and here are his pioneering observations about how we should explain things in the natural world and how things operate. So the first quote is really quite striking. For Descartes, God is directly the source of all emotion in the universe. Okay? God is the direct source of the motion. Nothing is motivated internally. God is doing it. God is doing the job. It happens rationally because God is immutable. Okay? And that's what a law of nature is. And here then are the English who you know, we have this famous notion that English empiricists against rationalists, etc., etc. They're all buying into this conception of laws of nature. There's no doubt about that, and they get it from Descartes. And here then is Boyle. God frames things from the beginning. The laws of motion don't come from matter. That was the old Aristotelian view. They come from God directly. Gravity itself would come to be understood by Newtonian thinkers as the direct activity of God. As Richard Bentley, the first Boyle lecturer, put it, gravity is the immediate fiat and finger of God in the execution of divine law. And then moving on to Newton himself, this is actually Roger Coates in the preface to the second edition of the Principia, but it's Newton's view as well. The business of true philosophy is to find out what laws God put into the natural world. That's what we're on about. The Newtonian spokesman, Samuel Clarke, one of the most underrated philosophical thinkers, I think, but the person who took Newton's side in the Leibniz-Clarke debate, gives us a similar view. The course of nature is nothing but the arbitrary will of God, acting continually on matter. Therefore, says Clarke, there's no such thing as a distinction between natural and supernatural. No such thing at all. It's only the unusualness of things that make us regard them as miraculous. Why? Because the ordinary operations of nature, just as much as the miraculous, are the direct activities of God in the world. And to think otherwise is to have a vulgar notion of nature, which is Robert Boyle's label. For these 17th century thinkers then, nature was an idle conception that added nothing to the understanding of the regularities of the world upon which science was predicated. Now, as we've seen, leading men of science in the 19th century continued to subscribe to this idea of laws of nature as God's laws. And we've already seen these guys. Here's Herschel and here's Whewell, and they are rehearsing precisely this conception of laws of nature. We could add a number of other witnesses, but let me throw in James Clerk Maxwell, who is generally regarded in the pantheon of deities in the physics world as ranking third behind Newton and Einstein, because he the second great unification after Newton, we say, unifying electricity, magnetism and light, and thus laying the foundations for special relativity and quantum mechanics, arguably. So think back to Philoponus, who does a unification job. Now we have Maxwell doing this unification job. Let me put him up on the screen so you can see him. So basically, he's a pretty good physicist, is what I'm saying. So his unification of physics is based on the assumption implicit here in this quotation, again about the laws of God having a divine origin, that because there is a single God, we should expect that the laws of nature should be able to be unified. And so the motivation for the Maxwell equations is this theological conception of the unity of nature based on a single creative act of God. So you can see his dates there. He is just before the naturalists arrive on the scene with their radically different version of events. So two features of the conception of laws of nature that we have from the 17th century to the 19th, two features that are worth noting briefly. First of all, the laws of nature derive their necessity from the fact that it is an immutable God who wills them into being. At the same time, they are in some sense contingent because God chooses them, and therefore they can have any values. So the first condition provides a guarantee for the inductive process, which is to say the reliability of nature and what we observe there. The second provides a motivation for experimentation because we need to discover exactly what law God has instantiated in the world. But, and here I think is the fateful aspect of that, if we compare this version of causality to the medieval one, we now have a flattening of all natural causality into a single layer of supernatural causation. God is doing all the work. We don't have that double conception, right? And why this is fateful is that that level of supernatural work is then easily, well, not perhaps easily, but it's possible to redescribe that in purely naturalistic terms and to understand laws of nature as just brute features of the natural world that don't require any further explanation. And in the late 19th century, this is precisely what happened. So 19th century champions of naturalism simply changed the valence of the laws of nature so that they were just brute, inexplicable features of the universe. This called for a strategic forgetting of the original theological justifications for the concept and a redescription of God's constant activity in the world as natural. So what Robert Boyle described as a vulgar error, the idea that nature is actually doing work out there, becomes an almost universal presupposition for modern scientific investigation. As part of the forgetting process, the champions of naturalism had to rewrite the whole history of science, not only removing references to the supernatural, but telling the story in such a way that sought to depict reference to the supernatural as directly at odds with genuine scientific understanding. It's a remarkable testament to their efforts that they were successful, largely successful, in accomplishing this. As I've already indicated, central to their strategy was an appeal to the general progressive frameworks of history to which they plugged in carefully selected historical episodes that they regarded as evidencing the march of a progressive naturalistic science. And the most familiar of all of these episodes is the Galileo affair, which epitomises for them how it works. Let me move on now to say something about how this story of the history of science gets retold. Both Thomas Henry Huxley and Roy Wood Sellers offer instructive examples of the history of naturalism genre, but it's worth looking briefly at an earlier history that exhibits the same structural features, and it's the short history of materialism that we find in John Tyndall's 1874 Belfast Address. This was a notorious address that really he was reviled from Belfast pulpits the Sunday after this universally. Poor old Tyndall. So Tyndall, incidentally, the Irish physicist who discovered the greenhouse effect, a very distinguished and very able physicist. So this Belfast Address was delivered at the annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, the same venue that hosted the Oxford debate here in the 1860s between Huxley and Wilberforce. The historical schema that Tyndall outlines in this address is basically the same that Thomas Henry Huxley will later set out, and it goes like this. Here's the story. When primeval man, is the term, turned his attentions to the workings of the world, the phenomena of nature were explained in terms of the activities of supernatural beings. These, however, proved unsatisfactory, quote, to the more penetrating intellects of our race, who sought explanations in terms of physical principles. This led in turn to the speculations of the classical atomists, Democritus, Epicurus and Lucretius, whose insights eventually culminated in the fully worked out atomic theories of Tyndall's own contemporaries. Now, there is, of course, some historical distance between the ancient atomists and those of the 19th century. Why, inquired Tyndall, quote, was the scientific intellect compelled like exhausted soil to lie fallow for nearly 2 millenniums before it could regather the elements necessary to its fertility and strength? The short answer was that Christianity had almost strangled the infant science in its cradle, and medieval Catholicism had similarly sought to ensure that it would never grow to maturity. The Church's treatment of Bruno and Galileo provided exemplary instances of this, and Tyndall mentions them. Only with the modern shattering of the authority of the Catholic magisterium was science again able to resume its natural development. This is the Protestant historiography, right? The central lesson of this history that Tyndall told in this address was this, quote, all schemes and systems which thus infringe upon the domain of science must, insofar as they do this, submit to its control and relinquish every thought of controlling it. Acting otherwise always proved disastrous in the past, and it is simply fatuous today. Now, interestingly then, Tyndall's history is as much about the present as it is about the past, because it's about carving out a space for science in Victorian society. So there are 3 elements to the history that I'll briefly rehearse. First was the idea that supernatural interpretations of nature were essentially in competition with naturalistic and materialistic ones. Second was the suggestion that the former was characteristic of a primitive stage of human development. This is what we see in Hume, Kant, all of those guys. Third, the natural course of human development from supernaturalism to naturalism was thwarted by various forms of positive religion, and all of this could be illustrated with a fairly standard set of scientific heroes and martyrs. And here are the heroes. Some of them are martyrs. Lucretius, Christopher Columbus, Leonardo da Vinci, Bruno, Galileo. The story made science and scientific progress central to the supernaturalism struggle, shifting its locus from the sphere of historical criticism and debates internal to Christianity into the realm of discussions about science. Let me just say, partly parenthetically, these histories often entail a canonisation of quite curious figures. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci and Christopher Columbus. Columbus's sole claim to fame was that he miscalculated significantly the circumference of the Earth and would have perished had he not been fortunate enough to run into America, because he thought he was going to Japan. Anyway, that's by the way. Lucretius, though, is the other interesting one. I say this partly because of Stephen Greenblatt's recent and frankly appalling book on Lucretius. But Lucretius, in the Victorian period, is transformed from a celebrated Roman poet of remarkable aesthetic sensibility into a proto-scientist and champion of materialistic atomism. If we want to get some idea of what the early Victorians thought about Lucretius, Thomas Babington Macaulay carried round with him a copy of De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, by Lucretius. He liked the poetry. This is what he scribbled in the margins. Folly, nonsense, wretched reasoning, exceedingly absurd, this is drivelling. Yet this doesn't prevent Macaulay, the great historian, from extolling Lucretius', quote, sense of beauty of the external world and the elevation and dignity of moral feeling. So in Macaulay's estimation, Lucretius was a sublime poet but a dud philosopher. And curiously, in the 20th century, the 21st century, it's precisely the reversal of that we get. So historical figures, on account of their status as heroes and martyrs, their valence also changes. Giordano Bruno is another example. A guy who's, frankly, a crazy mystic somehow becomes an icon of scientific rationality. Now, let me cut to Huxley. When Huxley comes to tell much the same story, he doesn't speak about materialism, but rather naturalism. Materialism had its problems as a term. But he retains the same building blocks for his history. So, from the time that historical records begin, he tells us naturalism and supernaturalism have consciously or unconsciously competed and struggled with one another, and the varying fortunes of the contest are written on the records of the course of civilization. Naturalism, he maintained, had always borne fruit, while supernaturalism yielded, quote, propositions that are vague and questionable. A dispassionate study of the evolution of human society, Huxley suggested, will reveal that progress has invariably, quote, been accompanied by a coordinate elimination of the supernatural from its originally large occupation of men's thoughts. Like Tyndall, Huxley regarded the ancient Ionian philosophers as the originators of scientific naturalism. Thus, quote, science took its rise in ancient Greece and after being dammed up for 1,000 years, once more began to flow 3 centuries ago. The cause of the blockage was once again, quote, the diversion of men's thoughts from sublunary matters to the problems of the supernatural world, suggested by Christian dogma in the Middle Ages. This came to an end in the 17th century, quote, one of the great intellectual epochs in the intellectual life of mankind, when physical science suddenly strode into the arena of public and familiar thought and openly challenged philosophy and the church. Gets that completely round the wrong way, I'm afraid, apart from the fact that the 17th century was a key moment in the evolution of modern science. When we get to the 20th century, then, with our friend Roy Wood Sellers, he will reprise the same story. So it's starting to get a familiar pattern. Naturalism has always arisen in opposition to what we call supernatural propositions. Okay, same story. The latter were characteristic of, quote, the age of myth, the older religious view of the world. Early man, quote, peopled his surroundings with conscious powers that shrouded the operations of nature in mystery. Scientific theory got its start when the Greeks, quote, left off telling tales. But alas, Greek civilization lost its nerve, inaugurating a long period of intellectual stagnation that came to an end with the Renaissance and the birth of modern science. But it was not until the 19th century that naturalism really came into its own. Quote, the centre of gravity of religion has been openly changing for some time from supernaturalism to what might be called humanistic naturalism. We are all naturalists now, is Sellers' conclusion. Now, these histories would be unremarkable if they bore a rough approximation to what actually happened, but they do not, and we already have a sense of this from the traditional theological character of the laws of nature that we've already seen. The work of historians of science over the past 50 years has made many of the general contentions of these histories unsustainable, and I've given some indications of just how unsatisfactory this version of events is. And these are, again, some of the books that actually do this demythologising work. I put them up there in the hope that more people will actually read them. The ancient Greeks cannot claim sole credit for inaugurating science. There was no transition in the Greeks from mythos to logos. Mythical and rational accounts happily coexisted amongst the Greeks. Just a few more of the titles that I've referred to. Neither was there a vast lacuna in the development of science coinciding with the rise of Christianity and stretching into the medieval period. There were indeed inauspicious social and material conditions that presented a challenge to the flourishing of intellectual activity for a time. Nevertheless, the medieval period saw the rise of the universities and with them the flourishing of robust philosophical and natural philosophical activity. As for the efflorescence of science that took place in the early modern period, there's a strong case that it was accomplished less by a separation of science from theology than by the forging of more intimate associations between them, and that's the notion of laws of nature. In all of this, crucially, there was no coherent conceptual framework that could be described as supernaturalism as it was defined by the 19th century. And this recent book that Martin mentioned, there's a number of historians who have contributed to this book. They come from across the religious spectrum, from atheists, agnostics to, I think, maybe even one very keen Protestant evangelical. But they tell the same story, and it's the story that I've given you a quick outline of. Not only are the naturalistic narratives not true to history, they were not even true to the contemporary context in which they were being preached, and we've already had this in the Q&A from our last lecture. As we've seen, significant numbers of distinguished scientists of the period had religious commitments. Moreover, the late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed an astonishing flourish of interest by leading scientific figures in spiritualism, the supernatural and the paranormal. These include, here we go, the co-discoverer of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, physicists William Crookes and Oliver Hodge, there he is, Nobel laureates Charles Richet and Marie Curie. And if you're interested in that story, Jason Joseph's Jason Josephson Storm's book, The Myth of Disenchantment, tells that story very well. There's also a website by Andreas Sommer called Forbidden Histories that will give you that story too. Despite this happening at the same time that the naturalists were developing their narratives, the stories that the naturalists invented form familiar plot lines now for popular histories of science, some philosophies of science too, and a good number of undergraduate textbooks. So Karl Popper, for example, in the middle of the last century wrote that, quote, "The scientific tradition was inaugurated by Thales and his immediate successors, the Ionian Greeks. It died in the West when it was suppressed by a victorious and intolerant Christianity. It was missed and mourned during the Middle Ages and eventually revived during the Renaissance and found fulfilment in Newton." These ideas also find their way into the public domain. If we go back to Carl Sagan's enormously popular book and television series Cosmos, quote, "For a long time the human instinct to understand was thwarted by facile religious explanations. But in 6th century Ionia, a new concept developed, one of the great ideas of the human species. And so it was that the great idea arose, the realisation that there might be a way to know the world without the God hypothesis." Again, he gets it completely the wrong way round. But here's the standard history with the standard heroes, and we still hear this told again and again and again. The 2014 follow-up to Sagan's television series Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey, Neil deGrasse Tyson, traverses precisely this well-worn territory, and here we get Giordano Bruno being presented as a martyr for science. Don't get me started on that. The historians of science were just tearing their hair out when they saw that series. But the idea that religion and science are competing explanatory systems and one's destined to replace the other is a staple of popular science and indeed the new atheist rhetoric. So here's Richard Dawkins. Religion's just bad science. That's how it works. Historically, religions have historically tried to answer the questions that science does. Right? So there's this pattern. Science, religion, competing explanations for the same thing. Sam Harris, a slightly more virulent version. You get the clue is in the title here for the paper, but the conflict is zero-sum, he says, that you've got religious dogma or you've got science, and they're both trying to do the same thing, but only science is doing it properly. So the success of these are just two examples of this, how successful the Victorian naturalists were in getting their agenda into the public domain. The success of these stories, given their variance with the evidence, may seem puzzling, but the fact is that few today are actually aware of the true histories, hence the importance of doing careful historical demythologising work. Moreover, in their favour, these narratives, the false narratives, have all the hallmarks of a good story. Heroes and villains, courageous individuals willing to stand up to repressive authorities, and a general plotline about the victory of reason over ignorance. They confirm us in our intellectual superiority, just like the myth of the Enlightenment confirmed the Enlightenment philosophy in their identity as icons of reason. Further, the conceptual apparatus that these narratives bear along with them already does much of the work. Thus, while we continue to think that categories like naturalism and supernaturalism genuinely divide up the world in a meaningful way, we're already halfway committed to the morals of these false stories. Finally, these narratives were originally forged with a view to establishing the social legitimacy of the natural sciences and their independence from undue influence. So it's understandable why these myths were developed. And today, science continues to be under threat from climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, young earth creationists and others. And so there's comfort in clinging to these old myths, and that's why they still have their resonance today, and why they resist attempts by historians to deconstruct them. All right, let me come to a conclusion to this lecture and a conclusion to the series. And I don't know what I've done with my watch, but I think we're on track for a conclusion. So, where does all this leave us? My suggestion at the beginning of the previous lecture was that our modern scientific worldview needed to be demythologised in the straightforward sense that we need to disentangle scientific activities from the distorting historical myths that have become attached to them. And one such myth that's been the regular target of historians of science over the past 2 decades has been the narrative or the story of a perennial conflict between science and religion. One of my goals in these lectures has been to expose what I think is an even more fundamental myth, the common claim that the remarkable successes of modern science are clinching evidence for the truth of naturalism, understood as the doctrine that the physical universe and its laws are all that there are. If that were true, science would indeed generate difficulties for traditional religious belief. However, as it turns out, the myth that science equals naturalism is underpinned by a false historical narrative, which, although corrigible in the sense that historians can show it to be false and deficient, continues to be retold and exercises a powerful grip on modern imaginations. I hope also to have shown that there's another aspect to this myth, in addition to the narrative component, and that's the conceptual apparatus of the naturalism-supernaturalism distinction. This disjunction is a problematic one, and whereas no amount of historical research can show it to be false, what we can know from history, and indeed from anthropology, is just how idiosyncratic a distinction it is and how few scientific thinkers in the past subscribe to it. The conduct of science, if history is any guide, does not require this distinction. So my hope is that a historical perspective offers us some resources for thinking differently about what we now call the supernatural, and that we might reflect upon an inevitable tendency to assume the superiority of the ideas, concept and knowledge of the particular historical moment in which we are now living. This calls for a critical appraisal of what is perhaps the most pervasive and fundamental myth of Western modernity, and that is the idea of progress. In particular, we need to work hard to decouple the undoubted material benefits that science has delivered, electricity, dentistry, the iPhone, and so on, from exaggerated claims about its status as a unique means of accessing the truth. And this points us to another deeper level of the mythology of science that I've not addressed in detail, and that's the consistent conflation of the material utility and the predictability that the sciences undoubtedly deliver us with the idea that they offer privileged access to truth. That's a conflation. Okay. I may say something more about this afternoon. So it's to mistake utility with truth. I may say something more about this afternoon, but offer 2 brief comments. For Bultmann, myth entails a process of illicit objectification, and in the case of the New Testament, that objectification was spatial. 3-tiered universe, heaven up there, hell down there, and so on. In the case of some of the contemporary sciences, we have an analogous objectification of the theoretical objects that are part of it, and this goes from genes to subatomic particles. Now, I'm not going to make a case for demythologising those, but there is a case to be made. And as I say, I won't go into that. The other brief observation that I would offer is simply that the methods of historical criticism and the apophatic epistemology that was so eagerly adopted by the scientific naturalist and brought across from the religious domain have a corrosive power that is more dangerous to the truth claims of the natural sciences than to the truth claims of Christianity. Thus, Thomas Kuhn, for example, in the opening lines of this famous book, says that history, if viewed as more than a repository for anecdote and chronology, would promote a decisive transformation of the image of science by which we're now possessed. Curiously, that transformation has largely not taken place, except amongst historians of science. But just to show that it's not just Kuhn arguing this, let me give you a fascinating quote from Alistair McIntyre, back when he used to think about these things. And this underscores a number of the themes that I've developed in these lectures. The first is about dramatic narrative being the crucial form for understanding human action, and that science as a rational form of inquiry can't actually be understood apart from its setting as a true dramatic narrative. And in a sense, what the naturalists were able to do was to construct a false dramatic narrative about science that we think explains its rationality, but it does not. Okay? Scientific reason, then, he says, turns out to be subordinate to and intelligible only in terms of historical reason. And this is why science is more susceptible, in my view, to historical criticism than Christianity itself. So my suggestion has been that the intelligibility of scientific reason is crucially dependent on an understanding of its true history and it is elements of that true history that I have attempted to offer in these lectures. Finally, last thing, I want to go back to where I started and address the nostalgic idea of a possible return to enchantment, because I kind of dangled that out as a possibility. So here are the key bits of McIntyre's interesting statement. But as I say, let's get back to Aristotle. And you recall we started with the myth of Aristotle's cave and the scenario from the film and book The City of Ember. And it may seem what was on offer in these lectures was a prescription for recapturing lost enchantment. And there it isn't, but I'm going to give you some tentative thoughts very briefly. The first point is that knowledge of or mediated access to the transcendent is still possible in a disenchanted world. And recall that in Aristotle's parable, the people who lived under the ground still had some dim inclination of the existence of the gods. They had learnt by report and hearsay. And in my view, that's what natural theology does in the present situation. It's not very good, but it's better than nothing, okay? If we think about the moral of the City of Ember story, and here the moral is that if we replace a false history of how we got to where we are with the true version of events, we're in a position to return to the real world, as it were. And this is why I've attempted to point to an alternative and hopefully better history of how we got to here, how we got to where we are. And while this in itself may not provide the roadmap for showing the path back to enchantment, it should at least illustrate some of the deficiencies in the way we routinely think about our present predicament. Second, I've also suggested, albeit in very underdeveloped terms, that the way we experience the world is determined by narratives, by the concepts that we operate with, and by the practices that we engage in. These lectures have mostly been about the first two, the narratives and the concepts. But in a sense, the practices is the key. And for those of you who are in the afternoon seminar, you'll recall this quote from Pascal about belief. And here is the key part of the quote that we saw. For Pascal, belief does not arise by our rehearsing to ourselves the arguments for the existence of God, but by participating in a particular form of life. And as I say from the quote there, you get some sense in what Pascal's on about. Pascal, in short, recommends participation in the life and rituals of a believing community. And in the present, there are radical versions of this. Here's one radical version. And this is one way of getting around the formative influence of technology. I'm not recommending this, I'm reporting on it, okay? But the Amish are not completely crazy. There's an updated version of this in Rod Dreher's Benedict option, and again, Rod Dreher thinks a new form of barbarism is upon us. I'm not entirely sure, but again, here the point is not to do the Bultmann-like demythologisation, but to carve out your own space, so to retreat from the world and form your own community. Again, I report, I don't recommend necessarily. Dreher sees a coming dark ages when Christians must withdraw from secular society and batten down the hatches. This is a very different approach to Bultmann's, who wants to make Christianity credible to the world. Here we give up and we retreat to maintain the capacity of living in some kind of enchanted existence. The other problem with the Dreher prescription, I'm not sure his historical predictions are on the right track, and this leads me to a last final observation, and that is that the world may not in fact be as disenchanted as the standard narratives of modernity lead us to think. And that was the point of this thing, that there are more witches than Presbyterians in America, that we briefly looked at last week. In the West, it turns out that there is a strong persistence of belief in the unusual and the paranormal. And this is from some time ago, but it's a poll about supernatural beliefs in the USA, Canada and the UK. Somewhere above 25% of people in these countries, according to this survey, believe in haunted houses, astrology, extraterrestrial visitations and communication with the dead. And these data will hold up in this 2009 survey again, read for yourself, you get the general idea. When we broaden our focus to non-Western countries and consider belief in sorcery, talismans and exorcisms, we see even greater evidence for the persistence of enchantment. And I know the detail is probably too small for you to see, but those green lines represent significant amounts of belief in these things. Now, last paragraph, traditional secularization theory, just like the progressivist three-stage histories of the Enlightenment, predicted that these kinds of belief systems will eventually succumb to some inexorable historical law that will render them into the disenchanted world of the modern secular West. But it's now common to speak of the return of religion and the re-enchantment of the world. And certainly if demographic patterns are anything to go by, the world is becoming ever more religious. And again, you probably can't read this graph, but the take-home message is on the side. The fastest growing nations in the world are the most religious ones. So it may well be that in the overall scheme of history, Western secularity and scientific naturalism is not the ultimate terminus of all human cultures, but an eccentric sidetrack that leads to a dead end. And if we live long enough, we might just find out. Thank you. Does the practice of science require belief in God? Again, empirical question. No. My point was that historically it has typically, and the interesting thing for me, the interesting philosophical question for me goes to the question of the legitimacy of scientific activity, and I mean legitimacy in the sociological sense. So again, so my view is that, to use Renan's phrase, science is exactly existing on the perfume of an empty vase, right? And this is, so again, empirically predicting into the future, what we know about history is that for much of its time, for the vast bulk of time, science had religious legitimation that was key to its success. It doesn't have that anymore. I take your point, you're exactly right. Of course you don't have to believe in God or have religious beliefs to do good science. Absolutely not. Let's see where the whole enterprise ends up in 20, 50, 100 years. Second question I'll take as a comment. Third one, sorry, just repeat the... Sorry, Galileo. Yeah, well, I can go on about Galileo forever. Galileo was tried in 1632. He was found guilty of heresy. He was placed under house imprisonment. Absolutely no doubt about that, although the house in which he was imprisoned was a rather nice villa in Florence. But the issue of the Galileo affair, we tend typically to think in terms of science and religion. It was not. It was about competing versions of science. And Galileo championed, as we know, the heliocentric view. The Catholic Church, either version of a Tychonic or Ptolemaic view. The scientific evidence was clearly in favour of the Catholic Church's position at the time, although this will come as a surprise to many of us. And the key argument against the motion of the Earth was the fact that stellar parallax was not observable, or if in fact the Earth was in motion, the size of the celestial bodies would have to be something like the diameter of the solar system. Most scientific thinkers realised that this was a huge problem, and so that the evidence in the Galileo affair, if we're going to talk about it purely in terms of science, was clearly in favour of those who were supporting the Tychonic and the Ptolemaic model. So it's not... Sure, so Was it a good idea for the Catholic Church to persecute Galileo? No, it was stupid and it was dumb. And if they hadn't done it, there wouldn't be much about these histories to tell. But they did. What was it about? It wasn't about science and religion. Okay? That's the short version.
Thank you for your talk. You noted that early on, like some of the scientific thinkers switched the idea of law of nature to keep the direct causal element of God, which was different from pure Lombard, the earlier idea of there being a sort of dual causation. And that allowed for this sort of switch to say, well, this is purely natural law, it doesn't require. My question is even on Lombard's view, you still have a causal agent, even if you remove the primary cause of God. So it seems like it's even possible, even on Lombard's view, in fact, it seems a little bit more easier because God is now the only agent causing these laws to exist.
Sure. So I guess we have to understand how it is that God makes. There's two aspects. God actually makes the natural cause work by concurring with its operation. And so that it's not as if the natural causation doesn't work without God. God must, and the standard model was one of concurrence, that God must concur with the inherent natural operation of the agent for it to work. And part of that also is the fact that God sustains everything in existence moment by moment. So there's a few levels at which God is, in a sense, already causally involved in what would be regarded as purely naturalistic. And it's only at that supernatural level where God, by a miracle, does something without relying on any of the potency that he's placed into things. But, one way of thinking about it is if you just think about the distinction between God's notion of conservation and God's... Well, here's how I'm getting myself into knots here. Forget Descartes as well. There's the difference between God creating things ex nihilo and his ongoing preservation of them is really a conceptual distinction that we make. So, in other words, the fact that things continue to exist is a function of God's ongoing operations, and that's the kind of medieval view. So you've got conservation of things in existence, and you've got concurrence with their causal things. So God's already doing a significant amount of the work at that natural level. Does that make sense? No, I agree with you completely, Andrew, that the main function of the concept is not to do with what's going on in the natural world at all, but it's really understanding of how the distinction between the natural and the supernatural gifts, which is that's really the key understanding. But in a sense, because my focus was on understanding the natural world, that's the meaning of it. But you're exactly right that if we're thinking about the big picture, what the concept means, its chief function is actually in a quite different sphere.
I wasn't here last week, so if you've answered this question already, I'll withdraw it. I feel very uncomfortable with this whole notion of the supernatural, and it's unclear to me exactly what you mean by it. And then, if you can say briefly what you mean by it, is it a word which has any usefulness?
Now, excellent question. If you're confused by what I mean by the word supernatural, my work here is done. That's precisely the intended effect. So yes. So in a sense, what I want to say is we have a terminology that we use. It's a problematic terminology, and if we could perhaps back away from thinking in terms of natural, supernatural, And what I've tried to do is to use historical examples just to get us a sense of how it might work in other ways. And I don't know whether we can import those ways from the past into the present. So in a way, as I say, if you're confused about the conception of supernatural, good. And I'm not going to answer the question about what it is, because that's really the point.